Welcome to the a16z podcast. I'm Michael Copeland, and we have a full house this afternoon to talk about Apple's latest event. With us is Benedict Evans, Zal Billamoria, and Frank Chen. Welcome, guys.
Hello.
Hi. Thanks.
Benedict, you've just returned from Cupertino and the packed hall there filled with applause and excitement. Let's take things in order. We start with the iPhone. Bigger, larger number. There was a plus. What's the takeaway here?
Yeah, iPhone 6 Plus does sound like kind of like a Microsoft product name, doesn't it? iPhone 6 Plus Professional Edition with Office.
Right.
2014.
Yeah, exactly. 2014 edition. So I thought the phones were relatively predictable, especially given how much had been leaked in advance. And of course, equally, what hadn't been leaked didn't show up.
Right.
So no big surprises there. It's become pretty clear that a large part of the high-end market wants a bigger phone and is willing to sacrifice the sort of ease of reaching across it with a thumb. And so Apple has gone there. And so we have two new models, one of them which is, I think, 4.7 inches, which is basically a big phone, and one is more of a kind of a phablet size. The interesting thing, I think, is that Apple in the last couple of years has evolved iOS 7 and iOS 8 to get away from pixel-perfect layouts so that it's now technically possible for them to flex the size of the screen, which wouldn't have been possible 2 or 3 years ago because the apps just wouldn't have worked. So what they're actually doing is these devices have higher pixel density and more pixels. And if you run an app that doesn't know about these new things on it, it basically just blows them up. But the pixel density is so high that you really can't tell. And so the text is just rendered as text because the operating system knows that it's text. Any graphical elements are just blown up. But the definition of the screen is so high and the increase in scale is sort of small enough that you actually can't tell at all. So they're actually demoing these phones with apps that haven't been updated for this new size. The developers didn't know about it, and you really can't tell. Obviously, there's more space that they could potentially take advantage of, but other than that, you can't tell. So there's a really smooth transition there, I think. And the obvious takeaway is that this is a competitive problem for Samsung. Right. Because what you've seen at the high-end segment, and bear in mind what Apple hasn't done is change their pricing policy at all. So there's a one that's quote free unquote on a 2-year contract in the US, so $450 phone, which is still high-end. And that's fine. That goes from the 4S to the 5C. And then the 5S drops, the last year's flagship drops $100. And then there's a new flagship. And then there's the Plus, which is the larger one, is $100 more. So it's in the US, it's free $100, $200, $300. Outside of the US, it's $400, $500, $600, $700, or whatever the pricing turns out at. So the interesting thing here is, as I said, we're saying that when you look at the high-end segment, that Apple is really the only place Apple competes. They've probably only got around half of that segment, and the other half is high-end Android, and almost all of that high-end Android is with bigger screens.
And so is it an acknowledgement? I can remember, Apple always does this, but they're dismissive of something that they don't do. So larger screens are like,
yeah. No one wants an iPod that can play video.
Right. Until they do it, right?
No one wants a tablet with a smaller screen. You'd have to get a pencil. This is Steve Jobs said, you need a pencil sharpener for your fingers to use a 7 or 8 inch tablet. Right. Well, everything is wrong until it's right, and everything's right until it's wrong. Who cares? Clearly, what's emerged is that people are willing to use these slightly larger screens, and because of all the stuff that you can do on them. And so Apple has just shifted. They shifted twice. Once they made the iPhone 5 look slightly bigger, and now it's slightly bigger again. It's worth noting, incidentally, that the phone itself is very thin. It's noticeably thinner than the 5, so the overall weight is that much smaller. It seems like effectively the metric we've gone from is the length of your thumb to the size of your pocket.
Right.
And of course, with a phablet, 50% of the buying population is going to put that in a bag. So again, it doesn't really matter at all.
Right.
What I found interesting actually is that Apple's foray into China was supposed to be the 5C, and that really didn't go anywhere. And the 6 Plus with phablets seems to be the right way to potentially go into and get into Asian markets finally. I wonder how it's going to do in the US, but I think it's mostly the Asian strategy.
It does feel like when you look at the numbers, the phablet has done very well in South Korea, well generally in East Asia, gone really nowhere at all anywhere else. It's sold a little bit, but not very much. And so Apple is effectively addressing that segment, and also, of course, addressing the mainstream market that just wants a slightly bigger phone that can show slightly more stuff. And what they're not, of course, doing is coming out again with a new, cheaper product that can go into the Chinese market. Now, it will be interesting. I would suspect that the $100 cheaper iPhone 5S will do a lot better in China than the 5C did last year at the same price. The dynamic in China was if you can afford $500, it was actually a lot more than that because of all the taxes. If you could afford what the 5C cost, you could afford the 5S, and you didn't want to walk into a nightclub with a cheap one.
Right.
Because you're already in a very non-price sensitive segment.
Very quickly, iOS 8, did you guys see anything that changes?
There's nothing new. There's nothing new there. They just did a brief recap of the features.
Right.
Obviously, they've adjusted it to include support both for watches and for payments, which we're going to
that is a perfect segue into sort of what from the gasps and the oohs and the boos in our room with the big news of the day. So payments and the watch. Let's start with payments. Outline us for us what
have they
was
done?
Announced.
So much like you can kind of see the building blocks that they've had there before with a secure element for the fingerprint. So the way that this works is you buy a new iPhone, you log in with your Apple account that you've already got, and it automatically loads the credit card that you have in iTunes into it. If you don't already have a credit card in iTunes, then you can wave a credit card in front of the camera and it will acquire it into the system. And then there's a couple of moving parts. First of all, they have a deal with Visa, MasterCard, and Amex to support this. But your issuing bank has to support it as well. So it's not enough just to be a Visa card. It has to be a Visa card from Citibank or from one of the US institutions, and it's US only that supports it. Then the other part of the moving part, so you've got the card, once you've acquired the card into the device, you go into a store, and the store has to have NFC, which is this very short-range wireless technology that's been around for a decade and gone nowhere, which we'll talk about in a moment. So you acquire the card into your phone, you go into the supporting retailer, you hold your phone up to the till, and Passbook appears and your card appears on the screen, and you hold your finger on the fingerprint reader, and it's done. And so the big difference here is we've had all of these payment systems that have floated around before, and it was always, well, you've got to take the phone out, you've got to turn it on, then you've got to open the correct app, you've got to choose the correct card, then you hold it up, then you've got to enter a PIN number, then you press go. And it was actually more hassle to do that than just to pull your card out and do the card PIN or swipe the card. Whereas with the Apple experience is you hold the phone up to the thing and you have your finger on the button, and that's it.
So the application is really the Touch ID.
Yeah, exactly. So the whole user flow of it is a combination of the touch flow and the Passbook application that they've previously been using for tickets, which means it really is quicker than using a card, which is never on offer before.
So, Frank, I want you to jump in here. Tim Cook did that twice, and it almost came off as a joke because it happened so quickly. He's like, look, if you blinked, you missed it. But is that the whole point? And is that one of the things that was holding us all back from using NFC or payments like this?
Well, there were two things holding back NFC. One was the user experience, and it looked like from the demos that Apple may have solved that problem. The other was the availability of an NFC reader at the merchant. The good news on the NFC readers is that the United States is about to go through a massive deployment of EMV, which is chip and pin credit cards. The same reader will also support NFC, so merchants won't need two different upgrades. So it looks like there's a lot of momentum on the merchant side to be able to take these newfangled iPhones as payments.
I mean, I think there's a broader point here, which is, as we said, NFC has been around forever and gone nowhere. And one problem was the lack of the right user experience in the device. The other was there was just this general lack of momentum or critical mass behind adoption anywhere. So the retailers didn't have couldn't read them and had no incentive to get them. And now the US shift to EMV gives them an incentive for that. Meanwhile, from the device point of view, Android has had NFC for a couple of years, but it was like one device or two devices or three devices. So there might be a couple of 100 million Android devices in market that notionally have NFC, but nobody knows. And nobody knows if their device has NFC or not.
Well, I wonder if this kickstarts Android's efforts in NFC.
It's because Apple can say there is one device and it's in every device. It gives a lot more clarity, like every new iPhone has this. And because of the market scale that Apple has uniquely kind of in the USA with 40% of smartphones, they could then go to all the banks and all the retailers and say, this is all going to work and let's all just, get behind and push, which is kind of what, for example, the Japanese operators were doing in Japan 10, 15 years ago, that they would say every phone, every retailer, every card, it all just works. And then we can try and get the flywheel going with consumers. And that was what Google could never do because it had such a different approach.
So let's use Japan or Korea as an example. Did it work? And is everyone using it?
Well, yes and no. So when you look at the numbers in Japan, it's worked pretty well for things like transit cards.
Right.
It's worked very well for things like loyalty cards. And Japan is a very loyalty card heavy market, like the US, unlike, for example, the UK where I come from. So I was kind of startled when I moved here that every corner grocery store I came into offered me a loyalty card, which just doesn't exist in Europe in the same way.
Right. Well,
but then nobody in Japan uses credit cards. I mean, in Japan, quite literally, you go and pay your taxes in cash. So you get $15,000 out, and you put them in a bag, and you go to the post office and pay your taxes.
Right.
So it's difficult to extrapolate too far from Japan or South Korea because they have these sort of market peculiarities. I think the core issue here is that that what Apple is trying to do is remove all of the obstacles and get all of the building blocks all locked together and all kind of synced and turning, mixing my metaphors here, get all of the gears turning at the same time in the same direction with one kind of complete integrated product. And I think the problem that Google has had is because of the sort of launch early, launch often and iterate approach, you've never had a complete solution. It's a little bit like trying to launch FedEx with one city and one airplane. It doesn't work. You have to have 50 airplanes and 200 trucks and 20 cities before it starts working. And that's, I think, the approach that Apple has been trying to take.
I mean, the proof in the pudding is going to be the user experience. If it's really as simple as taking your phone out, putting your thumb on the Touch ID, and touching the NFC sensor at the retailer, then great. But I think that's going to be really the critical thing that's going to actually drive adoption, because that's what I think. I think that's where the concern is.
And do you think that they have came out of the gate at least with enough partnerships to sort of prime the pump on this?
I think they probably did. Yes. I mean, it's also worth noting that there's a bunch of issues around, for example, the data breaches at Home Depot and Target, which tend to reinforce these kinds of trends. There's an interesting thing here that's worth thinking about, though, which is once you virtualize the card, what do you do next? Because the model that Apple is talking about now is, I apply in the mail for my Capital One credit card and it arrives.
Right.
And then I wave it in front of the iPhone camera and it gets acquired into my iPhone. And then I presumably put the card in a drawer or shred it or something. But that's a bit like saying, well, the way you do digital music is you order a CD on Amazon, you rip it into iTunes, and then you sync it with your phone. That's clearly not the end point of where this is going to go. And so you can ask, well, okay, what happens to the access? Right now, Apple is saying, well, no one gets access to their payment information. The way HealthKit works is there's a repository of HealthKit information and apps can ask for access. So what happens if Mint gets to ask for your payment information? Well, of course, that's a bad example because Mint has your bank. But what happens if an application could ask for your payment information? What happens if I could download the American Express application and it can say, can I see your payment information? Oh, I can give you a better deal. Press here.
Right.
And then in 15 seconds later, a new American Express card arrives on your phone. So once you virtualize it, all sorts of other interesting things start becoming possible.
Do we have any evidence, and Frank, chime in here, from the iTunes store, for example? I mean, there's been no evidence as far as I can tell that Apple goes in that direction. It's very much sits in the middle in between these vendors.
Well, I think they're interested in providing platforms. I mean, there are always these sort of fantasies that Apple is going to become the giant octopus and it's going to do everything. And they always, when it comes to the crunch, they always back away from that and say, no, we make phones.
Right.
That's what we do.
Right.
We're not an airline. We're not a mobile network operator. Right. We're not a movie studio. We make boxes with circuit boards in. And I mean, we were talking about this earlier, that you can describe Apple as a sort of club where the price of membership is buying a new box every 2 years, and the benefits of being a member of the club keep expanding in terms of all these sort of incremental services.
And
around
a box
the edges.
Being a phone or an iPad.
A phone or an iPad or a watch, which we'll come on to in a moment. The other interesting thing we should just kind of put on the table to talk about is that there is an API for Apple Pay. So your iPhone app can, instead of requiring you to type in your credit card number, it can just ask for the credit card that's on the phone. So there's a buy with Apple Pay button in your app, and up comes a little panel with a fingerprint scanner and says you're going to pay Uber $35, and you put your finger on the scanner and it goes through.
Describe for me or translate for me, Apple Pay is sort of analogous to what we have in the world today. Is it like PayPal? Is it like...
No, I don't think so at all. I think this is kind of my point about how far Apple moves into adjacent value chains, which is they kind of don't. Apple didn't become a music label, for example.
Right.
They replaced Tower Records. They didn't replace Universal Music or EMI. And they're not replacing Citigroup here. the way PayPal would.
Right. They're riding the credit card rails that already exist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
They're just taking that piece of plastic. And basically, Apple kills little pieces of plastic. So
Right.
they kill floppy disks, and then they kill CDs, and now they would like to kill your credit card. But the card, the actual doing of being a credit card company is not about supplying you with little pieces of plastic. It's running a payment network and thinking about fraud and credit risk.
Well, and offering you credit and
Exactly.
and charging
That's
you.
what it is to be a credit card
Yeah.
company, and Apple has no interest in doing that.
Right.
Any more than they have any interest in, sending guys with interesting haircuts to nightclubs at 3 a.m. to look for bands. They don't want to do that. They just want to sell the MP3s.
Yeah.
But they do want to be your wallet. And if you contrast what's happening in Apple land with what's happening in Android land, if you've tried NFC payments in Android land, you have lots of stakeholders with their own applications clamoring to be your wallet. So you have ISIS, now known as Softcard. You have the carrier itself had a wallet, Sprint Wallet. You had Google Wallet wanting to be the wallet. And basically, it's like when you have to choose an application to handle an application type, right? You get to the terminal to say, which wallet do you want to handle this? In Apple land, it's going to be Apple. And the smoothness of the user experience you can deliver when there is one dominant wallet as opposed to 5 or 6 clamoring to be your wallet is going to be hard to beat.
Yeah, I was going to ask, before we move on to the watch, do you think that, we're going to start seeing people swiping their iPhones at stores or touching it, whatever the action is?
I think you're going to see a lot of people using it. Yeah, the combination of the ease of use, I think, is the interesting part. This has always been the question, both with payments and with watches, it's not so much the what as the why. Yes, you can put a card into a phone. You've been able to do that for 5 years. Now, Apple has made that easier. They haven't given you any sort of compelling reason why you do it, other than that it's sort of less hassle than taking your card out and swiping it. And for the last 10 years, people have said, well, it's not that much hassle to take your card out and swipe it.
Right. That ain't broken. It's not broken.
It's not broken.
Right.
And I think this is whereas, say, for example, the record industry was broken because they made you buy 10 tracks instead of the one that you wanted, for example. So you think, well, okay, so there's nothing wrong with this way of doing it as opposed to the other way of doing it. And you'll see people doing it. It's not quite clear what massive problem this solves from an end user, other than, well, it takes you a bit longer to take your card out of your wallet when you get to the store.
Although I have gone to stores where I had forgotten my wallet, my plastic, but I had my phone, and I was just so frustrated that I couldn't pay. So for people who, like me, are very absent-minded, it's awesome.
Well, this gets me back to the point I was making earlier about, well, what else can you do once you virtualize the card? Because if you could get to the point that, I could get a card in 5 minutes instead of, or if I lose my card, if I could get the thing in 5 minutes instead of waiting for the mail. Maybe that's the point. That this isn't so much about killing the card; it's about killing the paper mail, where you've got to wait for the thing to arrive.
To take a very common analogy, this is probably more of a vitamin than a painkiller at this point, right? You're talking about, what is truly mobile payments? Getting into, ordering a Lyft car, getting into it, and then not having to take your phone out. They automatically charge you, and you send the rating in after the fact. That is truly mobile payments. So one can kind of think about Apple Pay, NFC, this idea of facilitating offline commerce, brick and mortar commerce as a bridging solution until kind of, maybe 10, 20, 30 years from now, when everyone's got mobile apps and mobile devices and tablets, and even every retailer, every supplier, and every buyer as well has all of these devices and apps, and this can all happen automatically. But I think until then, you need this potential solution potentially, but I think it may just be a vitamin at this point.
I think this comes. It's a good sort of way to lead into the watch, because I think what I was saying last week was that for both of the things that were rumored that have both come true, which is both the watch and the payments, you can certainly see how you could make a thing. The question is, and the thing might be really good, but it's not entirely clear why you want the thing in the first place.
It's worth talking about this vitamin versus painkiller thing from the merchant's point of view. So something very interesting is happening next October, which is the liability shift. So what the liability shift means is who owns the liability when you have a fraudulent credit card. Today, it's the card associations or the issuing banks. In October 2015, that will shift away from the payment networks to the merchant or the card issuer. And so if you don't have one of these EMV or NFC devices, and somebody swipes a fraudulent credit card, all of a sudden you as the merchant for the first time are responsible for the losses as opposed to just pawning it off on your card issuer. And so when that shift happens, the merchants definitely have a painkiller here, which is they'd love for you to use your iPhone or another NFC device because then they can't own the fraud associated with somebody owning a fraudulent credit card.
And again, for security reasons, if I lose my phone, it needs my fingerprint to associate with my phone and make a payment. And it seems fairly...
Yeah, so I mean, we can dig into this a little bit more. So basically, the phone does not have your card number on it.
Right.
It's a set of tokens which neither Apple nor the retailer itself ever actually see.
Right, this is what they're calling the secure element feature.
Yeah,
right.
So it's this complex set of crypto, which means that nobody actually sees the card number. It's just that your card issuer knows that it's you. Which, of course, speaks to the problem that we saw at Target of Target systems being hacked. Well, in this case, Target would never have seen the cards in the first place.
Right.
It also means that if the phone disappears, even if it's unlocked, somebody can't get your card numbers off the phone. All they've got is these things. And of course, equally, Apple, you can wipe your phone remotely
The remote wipe.
with a remote wipe, so you can just kill
phone
it.
is dead.
And your cards have not been stolen, so you don't need to cancel all of your cards. You just remote wipe the device.
The other part of this that is very different from Google is that Apple doesn't know, at least according to Tim Cook, what you bought, how much you paid for it. I mean, there's none of that sort of loop of information.
Exactly. Well, this is the interesting thing about health as well. So Apple is making this repository in iOS 8 that stores all the health information from a watch, from any wearable that you have, anything you input into it. Any app on the device can ask for that with permission. Apple never sees it. And that's obviously very different from the Google approach. And it's something that Apple seemed to be trying to build up as a marketing point. Obviously, we saw Microsoft try and build privacy as a marketing point and kind of fail. But Apple is kind of keep circling around and coming back to this point that we don't need to know anything about you. Our business model does not depend on us knowing stuff about you. I mean, it's not clear how much real consumers actually care about this stuff, but it's kind of an interesting point of difference.
Yeah.
Right. Apple's made the money it wants to make from you as soon as you buy the iPhone.
Right.
It doesn't need an ongoing stream of advertising revenue on the back of that for it to make its business model work.
So the watch, did you, Benedict, pick one up, put it on your wrist, wave it around?
Picked it up, put it on my wrist. It's not finished. The one that you can wear just has a looping video. The one that you can look at is firmly on the wrist of the Apple employee, and they're in a scripted tree that they don't deviate from. So you can point at that app, but they won't open it for you.
Uh-huh.
So it ain't done yet.
So
But,
okay.
they've said it's not done. It's not shipping until the spring. So there's a couple of observations. One is it comes in two sizes. The small one is perfectly small. It doesn't feel like you're wearing a brick on your wrist. It's not, it's not a $5 quartz watch that's incredibly tiny and plastic, but it's not a big lump anymore. They're not talking about battery life at all, and they've not given any technical specifications. They kept saying all day, all day, all day, but they clearly expect you to charge it every night. Every night is kind of okay. And the Android stuff on the market, most of them seem to more or less make it all day. And since Apple has obviously much tighter control of the hardware and software, you'd expect them to do a bit better. I mean, they tend to do 10 or 20% better with the phone, so they should do that on the
So to be
hardware.
clear, it sounds like this watch will last a day.
It should do, yeah. That's certainly what they're promising.
And to me, this seems like an accessory. Right?
Yeah, so then
this is not a
there's-
replacement.
It's not a replacement. Well, yeah, but Android Wear isn't kind of a replacement either. There's a basic battery issue here, which is you cannot stick a 3G chip in a device that small with a color screen and have it last all day. It just, it's really, really hard to do that at the moment. So all of these things need some kind of other thing. Which means a phone, and this needs to be run from an iPhone, just as the Android Wear needs to be run from an Android from an Android phone. Now that said, there's a really big philosophical difference, because if you look at Android Wear, it is really essentially a remote screen for Android. I mean, it's all you've been wearing one for a while, but fundamentally it's about displaying and interacting with notifications on the device, plus a few other things like Android, like Google Now, and they've just started rolling out an SDK that lets people start writing apps for it, but that's kind of a secondary focus. For Apple, this is a standalone device. I mean, except that it's got like a remote modem in form of the iPhone. You can put apps on it. It's got a full-on UI for choosing different apps. It's much more of a little computer.
It's a standalone device or devices. We were talking about what sort of buckets does it fill as a watch?
It's a bit more like Apple TV as opposed to Chromecast. And again, Chromecast is just a remote display. Apple TV is more like a little thing of its own, which you sort of need an iPhone at some point, but you can kind of use it without as well. And I think that's the same thing here. And it's a platform. And so the thing that I was really strongly reminded of was the original iPad, where the demo. This is again the point that one of my colleagues was saying. It felt like everything. There's a kind of kitchen sink thing going on here. It's like, how many different use cases can we show you? It can do this. It can do this. It can do this. It can do this. And the underlying point is, it's a piece of glass and it can do anything. Right. And that was the insight of the iPad. It was the insight of the iPhone. It gets transformed by whatever app is running on it. And so then when Apple launched the iPad, they're like, well, it can do spreadsheets, it can do books, it can do video, it can do the web. It's like, we didn't really know what people are going to do with it. So let's just show you a whole bunch of things you can do and see what sticks. And it's pretty clear in hindsight that, for example, Apple probably wouldn't have bothered doing books, Right. That was just kind of a hedge.
I mean, and
they made a keyboard. They made a keyboard for the original iPad. They don't sell it anymore because that turned out that you didn't need that. And that was the same thing you saw here. It's like, it's a little piece of glass on your wrist. Well, what can you do with it? Well, you can do anything. It's got Unix and a CPU on it, or whatever you can do on a piece of glass that size it can do. So let's try and work out what that might mean. Whereas Android Wear is much more kind of reflecting the two companies' philosophies. Android Wear is an endpoint for the cloud. Whereas Apple's and an Android phone, in a sense, is more and more an endpoint for the cloud.
But let's just make a clear distinction here. Like, the similarity here is, the card metaphor is quite alive and well right now with the glances, right? So this is like Google Now cards on Android Wear. Apple's calling glances. You have these, lightweight apps that can be, whether it's a fitness app, an exercise app, a workout app, a clock app, whatever the case might be, and you swipe and you can kind of have that kind of really lightweight experience that Android Wear also has, that I've been experiencing with the watch that I've been using.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you can kind of over-systematize this. There is just kind of that slight difference in philosophy that Wear kind of needs to be lit up by Google, whereas the Apple Watch doesn't really need to be lit up by something somewhere else in quite the same way. And so,
but it requires an iPhone 6 or an iPhone 5.
Yeah, you need something to kind of enable it in some way. But it's not a
GPS.
remote. But it's not a remote screen in quite the same way that Android Wear.
They saw those people running. They saw those people running in the video, and they were using the watch. They had to have an iPhone with them because the GPS, had to be required in order for them to be able to run their various routes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No,
I mean, the way I think about it is, look, Apple wants you to be part of the club. They want to have as many products in that club to make club membership super compelling, right? And so the watch makes you a member of the club, requires an iPhone. The anchor tenant, by the way, the thing that gets you in the club is the phone. And everything else Apple makes, in my view, is going to be an accessory to the phone. The watch is an accessory to the phone. The Yosemite, the next version of the Mac OS, makes the Mac an accessory to the phone, and it really just makes club membership that much more compelling.
Yep.
But it all ties you into the Apple ecosystem.
And you don't
necessarily, so you're not going to see watch that works with an Android phone, right? Like, they're just not going to do that.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is, if you look at, but going back to the app of the new iPhones, would you buy the iPhone 6 Plus and an iPad Mini? Probably not, because they're pretty similar in size. Would you buy an iPad Air and an 11-inch MacBook Air? Probably not, because they're really close in size. Would you get a watch, an iPhone 6, an iPad Air, and a 27-inch iMac? Maybe. So it's kind of a question of, which adjacencies do you want on spectrum? Now, you can see they're kind of taking this to the logical extreme. If you look at Samsung, which has a device at every half-inch increment from 2 inches to 15 inches, or more if you include the TVs.
Right. If you include the TVs, they go all the way out to like 100 inches.
So, Benedict, you raised the question of why, the why part. Did we get an answer?
I feel like we were much closer to we were why in the phase in the iPad. It was much more of an iPad why, I thought, which is, there's clearly going to be stuff here. It's not quite clear what, but we've basically got a little Unix computer on your wrist. And I think the other piece to this, incidentally, and again, I think this comes back to the iPad, is if you look at all the other tablets before the iPad, they were all rectangular screens that did touch. So, there's nothing new about the iPad, but of course there was. And I think that's the other thing here is, when you look at the hardware design of it turned off, forget about the operating system, Apple have kind of nailed a nice thing that you would wear on your wrist, whereas all of the Android devices are still, I think, more minority.
Well, I'm waiting to get my Moto 360 tomorrow from Google I/O. So.
The Moto 360. So there were a bunch of people at the event today with a 360. It is, I would say, double the volume. maybe more.
The 360 is double the volume.
The 360 is double the volume of this small Apple model, maybe more.
So, Frank, as we were watching this, we were talking about, I think it was Johnny Ive and Kevin Lynch were trading doodles and heartbeats and things like that. And you brought up the question of community and whether some of the, say, fitness apps and or, other apps that are already out there, they do a really good job of building community. And so does Apple need to have this community built in? Do they build it themselves? How important is it going to be to the watch?
So most of Apple's community and social efforts have failed, right? They took Ping out of iTunes, Game Center. I still don't know anybody who uses Game Center. So those things have not worked. And so it's not instant death for Runkeeper or Stravia or Fitness Pal, like people who have built very vibrant communities. So it'd be interesting to see if they take another whack at it, to see if they can build a genuine Apple community. It's very ironic that Apple's failed in social because they have the biggest fan community for their products of all time, but they've never been able to parlay that into an active, engaged audience.
Except on the Apple Forum, which is the world's greatest sort of answer community.
I think there's a broader point in here, which is, again, if we go back to the celebrity photo leaks of last week, that Apple always talks about owning the whole experience and controlling the underlying the core technology, and they make their own chips. They make their own processors, they make the chips and integrate everything for the watch and the phones. You go and look at what they do online, and yes, iOS 8 is full of cloud, and yes, there's all these really tightly integrated and very clever things that use the cloud to enable these devices. But, the email is running on Oracle, the Find My Phone is running on something else, the photos are sitting on Azure. Not that there's anything wrong with Azure, but it's all kind of third-party stuff tied together. And that results in good experiences and good products. But every now and then you see the cracks. So, for example, the thing with the photo leak was, well, some bits of iCloud use two-factor authentication, but other bits just don't, because it's not built on one common platform that Apple designed from the bottom up to do iCloud. There was a great blog post a couple of years ago by someone who had been at Amazon and went to Google, talking about how everything at Amazon was one platform and all Amazon products and services were built on top of that platform, whereas everything at Google was built one off next to each other as like a new thing, and that Google had to change that. And a lot of what you've seen in the enterprise side of Google indeed has been about turning it into a platform. Apple does not have a platform in the cloud at all. And you kind of see that what you've got here are lots and lots of endpoints that are delivered and do great stuff, but they start from the user experience. It's like saying, well, we're going to have an email. It's like Google saying, well, we're going to have an email service, so we're going to be an email service. And then we'll go off and work out what the back-end service provision is, and we'll buy the Oracle one or the SAP one, and then we're going to do maps, and it's not built from the architecture from the bottom up, it's built from the top down.
Frank, last thoughts?
Well, I think, again, I'll go back to the phone being the anchor tenant. You could buy your phone every 2 years, right? And everything else is an accessory that you buy less frequently than that. And as long as they've got you on the upgrade treadmill of every 2 years you buy this new anchor tenant, it'll drive the need for the other accessories on slightly longer time frames, and then Apple's happy. You're part of the club.
Yeah, and each accessory locks you in. So you've got the phone, once you've got the watch, then your next phone is that much more likely to be an iPhone, and once you've got the iPad, then your next watch is that much more likely to be an iWatch, and so on. So they all reinforce each other.
And credit cards and debit cards at the end.
Yep.
All of that integrated into the Apple ecosystem.
Well, I will be looking at your wrists for the next couple of months, and also at how you're paying for things when you take me to lunch. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.